Dr. Marnie Lloydd specialises in international law related to armed conflict and humanitarian law and policy. She's a lecturer at the Faculty of Law, Victoria University of Wellington. Dr. Marnie Lloydd joins us right now. Marnie, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me on.
You'll have to forgive my little stumble there, but when I get something in my head, my dyslexia won't let go of it. And Marnie Lloydd, who is a lecturer in law, those words are being jumbled in my head a little bit, so I apologize in advance.
No problem at all.
And
no
if
problem.
I do it again, that's an apology in advance. Now let's bring up an article that was in the conversation because we really want to talk to it and about it. I'm trying to figure out how we do it. You wrote a piece for the conversation because it talks about academic rigor with journalistic flair. I'm a subscriber and I like the reads here. Your article is titled, "There is little to stop New Zealanders leaving to fight in Ukraine, but few legal protections if they do so." This week, we're attempting to, and we're going to maybe next week, speak to one of the Kiwis born in the Ukraine who is going back to Ukraine. He left when he was 80, he's now 41. And so there are New Zealanders definitely going back, and we're interested as to what it all means, how it pans out, what it means legally, which is, I guess, what you've written about and what we've got you here to talk about. So let's just start with the obvious question. Is it legal or illegal for a Kiwi to fight in Ukraine right now?
Starting with the big, hard question. Look,
Yeah.
I actually I did a whole PhD on this topic, so I've thought about it for years and I still don't know if I have the full answer. Look, basically, so countries grapple with this, right? And different countries have different rules. Here in New Zealand, we've got laws that prohibit people being involved in mercenary activities. And then we've got anti-terrorism laws to prevent people being involved in terrorism. But we don't actually have an overarching law that prevents either foreign enlistment. So if someone wants to sign up and enlist in another country's military, or foreign fighting, which is usually a term, it's not a legal term, but it's used to describe people that might go and join a non-state armed group or some kind of militia group, or go and do something by themselves somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Some countries do have laws that are more robust. So Australia, for example, they've got a law that they call their foreign incursion law. So that would prevent people from travelling overseas in order to sort of take up arms against another state, so against another government. So their law is a bit more robust in that sense. But New Zealand doesn't have that. So all of that to say, I don't think that someone that went to fight in Ukraine would face prosecution on their return home, for example. Yep. But especially not if they're also a Ukrainian citizen. If they've got dual nationality, then that's sort of a different question. But I think what's really important to point out is that anyone fighting in Ukraine, whether they're part of the army, whether they're like a civilian volunteer that's participating, everybody needs to comply with the law of armed conflict. So that's the law that's set out in the Geneva Conventions and other bits and pieces of law. And if someone doesn't, if there's serious violations of that law, so that law is, don't target civilians, treat detainees humanely, that kind of thing, don't target hospitals. Serious violations of that law, they're war crimes. And so even if it's not unlawful under New Zealand domestic law for someone to go, if there's evidence that they've done something wrong while they're fighting, then they could for sure be prosecuted for war crimes under New Zealand law.
Yeah. I want a question on that. I've got a couple of questions straight away. I'll jot down mercenary to come back to it. The Geneva Convention is fascinating because it seems that there is no such thing as a war that abides by the Geneva Convention. Because I understand that as soon as a civilian dies, you've broken the Geneva Convention, and there isn't a war anywhere ever at any stage where civilians don't perish. Maybe you could say at the moment, maybe Ukrainians aren't killing Russian civilians, but I'm interested as to how that actually gets used, because I mean, I don't know enough about it. You're the expert, but it appears to me that there's no such thing as a war following Geneva Conventions because civilians always seem to die. Is that accurate, or am I missing something? Well, I'm missing a lot, but am I missing something in particular?
I think what you're saying is accurate, and you're also missing something. If I can be so bold as to say that.
Sure.
So yeah, fully agree. I mean, it's clear that war is bad, and people die, and civilians bear the brunt of it. Let's face it. I mean, soldiers are also directly in the firing line. Lots of soldiers are going to die, have long-term injuries, have long-term trauma, but civilians really bear the brunt, and that's all over the world and all different kinds of conflict. The thing with this law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law is another name for it, law of war, Geneva Conventions law, and actually it's a little bit of a controversial part of it, is that it does not, its purpose is to try to restrain violence in war, to try to reduce harm, to protect civilians and civilian houses and hospitals and that kind of thing. But it also allows it. So not every civilian death is a war crime.
Right.
Some kind of incidental harm, you will have heard this term collateral damage.
Sure.
So there can be lawful collateral damage as well as unlawful collateral damage. And so an enemy, if you're in a war, an enemy under these Geneva Conventions is allowed to kill the enemy. They're not allowed to directly target a civilian, but they are allowed to target and kill their enemy, and that's not a war crime, obviously.
But as soon as they target a civilian location, you couldn't really call that collateral damage, could you? And I guess what I'm saying is I can't think of a war at any stage ever that hasn't at some stage sent a missile, dropped a bomb or something in a civilian area. So it's like, is the Geneva Convention something to aim towards? But realistically, it's never really happened in a war. Like, has there ever been a war where the Geneva Convention was adhered to?
So there's actually lots of examples where so I agree with you, that's probably never, ever been adhered to fully, right?
Yeah.
But there are lots of examples where those rules have worked, have been respected, and people have been protected, where aid workers have been, kept safe, where families have been reunited, where POWs have been looked after properly. So there are good examples. And of course, we focus on the bad stuff, and fair enough, because it's just atrocious what we see. We see what's going on, and it's horrible. So, huge problem in the respect for this law. But there are examples where it has helped.
But you're saying that there's moments within the good examples within conflict where it's adhered to, as opposed to saying it's adhered to for the whole conflict. I also wanted to ask you about the mercenary side of things. You said it's illegal to be or to act as a mercenary in New Zealand. We're reading articles about former New Zealand Defence Force veterans, or Defence Force veterans, quote unquote, escorting people to Ukraine. Now, I guess I don't mean to kind of nut down too much into that word, but to escort someone there seems like it's more than just altruistic. It seems like it's potentially, I don't know, but I mean, when we get to talk to our guy, we'll ask him this, but a financial incentive or reward or something in there. And if that is the case, if these former defense forces then end up taking up arms in Ukraine, are they technically mercenaries when they're on the ground in New Zealand, i.e., I'm at the airport escorting, my purpose for leaving is to escort this person, or do they become mercenaries when they pick up a gun in that land?
That's a really good question. Are you sure you're not a lawyer deep down? That's a real lawyer's question. So listen, the definition of them, so the term mercenary kind of gets bandied around a lot, and fair enough, because we use it in day-to-day speech. Legally speaking, there's quite a long definition, and you have to meet these kind of cumulative criteria. And one of the criteria is, so one is that you're foreign, one is that you've been recruited especially to go and fight in that overseas war, one is that you're not enlisted in the armed forces. So, so for example, people that do choose to go to Ukraine and are accepted into this foreign legion that Ukraine has set up, that foreign legion is officially part of the Ukrainian armed forces. So they'd fall out. So all of these criteria, as long as you can easily fall out from it. It's quite hard to fit into it. The key thing with the mercenary is the financial. It's someone who's motivated for financial reasons to go. And under the New Zealand law, if I'm not mistaken, it says that the person has to be paid substantially more than what a local soldier would be paid.
Okay.
Which I don't think is the case with this foreign legion. Now, if someone's going sort of independently and escorting someone, it sounds to me more like a kind of private security detail. The risk there is that one of the criteria of being a mercenary is that you actually have to fight. You have to directly participate in the hostilities. So people that are doing training or acting as a medic or something like that wouldn't fall into that necessarily. The trouble is once you're over there and you need to defend yourself, it's likely or it could happen that someone then, even if they weren't intending to fight, they're going to protect themselves and they might end up fighting. And that might bring them closer, and they'll lose their protection. They would be a civilian, and then if the civilian starts directly participating in the hostilities, the enemy is allowed to attack them, then they're not protected anymore by this Geneva Convention's law. However weak that might have been anyway in the first place to protect them, right? But legally speaking, they would start participating and they would be able to be targeted.
I'm reminded of Syria, Marnie, and some British nationals that would come back home from Syria fighting alongside the Kurds and suddenly be charged under the Terrorism Act. I remember the same thing happening in America. So I guess what you're saying is as long as a Kiwi would fight with the Foreign Legion that the Ukrainian government has set up, and not end up fighting for, maybe if the Azov battalion was branded a terrorism organization by the New Zealand government, as long as they're not fighting for these non-state actors, they have a legal sort of right to be there.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a sort of much less concern, I would say, someone that's signing up for a foreign military. The Kurdish example is really super interesting because technically it's a non-state armed group. It was the Syrian Kurdish forces that were fighting at one stage against the Islamic State group, and then subsequently, there's been things with Turkey as well. And yeah, indeed, so Great Britain, the UK tried to prosecute a few people. New Zealand had a couple of people that went and fought with those forces as well. So the UK tried to prosecute them, and none of those prosecutions went very well. People were saying it doesn't make sense because these people were fighting on the side that the UK government was actually supporting. So how can you then prosecute someone? And especially if you're trying to prosecute them with anti-terrorism legislation, it was even sort of another complication. And there's really practical issues of how to get evidence, up to a criminal standard of what was happening. Countries normally rely on these sort of mutual criminal assistance things to get evidence from overseas, but when the country's, in the middle of a war, that's not really going to be possible. So, yeah, a lot of those prosecutions fell flat, and it's really something that countries grapple with. And I think it's obvious, right? We can feel it. We see any kind of Facebook post or whatever, Twitter, whatever, people saying, I'm going to go. And you'll see the mixture of comments. So some people are saying, oh, thank you, and you're so brave, and God bless you, good on you, and, and other people are like, dude, how arrogant, how are you, why, it's not your decision to go and take up arms. So it's obviously highly political. And the trouble for countries trying to make law about it is, it would be quite nice. It would be nice to have one law that's a clear law and it applies to everyone. And but then in reality, when you look at a local context, you kind of want that flexibility. Like,
Yeah,
we don't
because
want you to go here, but we don't mind so much if you go here. And so that's the problem, is how do you have a clear law, one rule, and then but you've got these exceptions because politically there's,
Yeah, because that flexibility often coincides with where the home country is politically, right? They were fighting alongside the Kurds against ISIS, for example.
Yeah, so what if they fight for Russia? That's one of the other questions. What happens if they go, if New Zealanders go and fight for Russia? I mean, is what Russia's doing? Are they committing war atrocities? Are they committing war crimes? If a Kiwi goes to fight for Russia, then what?
Yeah, so that's a really good example of how these complications come up. You think, oh, it'd be good, let's just have one rule and it applies to everyone. But then actually, we might feel okay about someone joining the Ukrainian military, but not the Russian military right now. Or, it can be hard for dual citizens. Some dual citizens have got, some countries still have conscription, so they've got to do a military service. And then what happens if their other nationality is a country that New Zealand politically is not on that side of in a particular thing? So, yeah, they're really complex issues. The law is complex because there's laws on the international level, and then each country will have their own domestic law that is supposed to reflect international law. But there's enough ambiguity there that different countries have ended up with different rules. And so you'll see about foreign fighting pieces that are sort of saying, oh, US former soldiers can go, British might be able to go, New Zealanders can go, Australians can't go, or another country. Some countries are more strict on it than and others are more permissive.
I've got it might be another lawyer question. I didn't mean it to be, but it might be another lawyer question for you, Dr. Lloyd. In most countries, most of the time, it's illegal to shoot and kill someone. What does the law say, or where is the line about a foreign national coming into a country, shooting and killing people in the name of war? And even in the region, I was kind of talking to George before the show, and I said, if I walked into Poland right now, right next door to Ukraine, and shot and killed people, I'd be arrested and tried and convicted of whatever. But then if I go 50 kilometers across a border and do it probably as long as they're Russian, I'm seen as a freedom fighter and a hero. How do we figure out that line in these kinds of situations? And I guess an addendum to that is, do we need to be careful, and there's anything legally about why someone's going there? If you had a mass murderer who just wanted to kill people and then they use this experience to go there and shoot and kill people, is that something that needs to be worried about as well?
Yeah, great questions. I'll start with the second one.
Sure.
So we know from Ukraine, there's been people volunteering on both sides of the Ukraine conflict from 2014. And there have been concerns that some of those people demonstrate support for right-wing extremist views, for white supremacist views. So, there's always that risk, either that someone gets more exposure or more connections to those sorts of networks. But even without that, just having been in a war scenario, it's my background before I started working at Victoria University was with the International Red Cross. I've worked in lots of war zones. I've worked in Afghanistan, I've worked in Sri Lanka, I've worked in the Somali part of Ethiopia, I've worked in Yemen, I've worked in Gaza, all over the place. They're traumatic situations, especially for the local people. Obviously, I'm not trying to compare my experiences with people from the countries suffering armed conflict, but even for aid workers, it can be traumatic, and then for soldiers even more. And then, so I think that is a concern of, it might only end up being a few New Zealanders, but those New Zealanders might need certain support when they come back, or there might be certain risks just from the violence that they've been exposed to. So that is definitely something that is talked about and connected to these issues. And then the other question about, we couldn't just pick up weapons here and start shooting at people. So how come when we cross the border, then suddenly it seems like we could do it? And there's a couple of things there. So one is, it's this idea during war that certain people have what's known as a combatant's privilege. So it means that if, say, imagine you're a soldier in an army, you can shoot at your enemy. You're not going to be prosecuted for murder after that. and we can understand that. So it's called a sort of privilege. And yeah, that's a bit the problem, that if people are fighting in an armed group or as a sort of civilian who's picked up arms, and then they don't have that privilege. And that's where you hear that language about sort of unprivileged combatants.
Right.
And the problem with that is that, so under the Geneva, on the international level, under the Geneva Conventions law, that's not really a problem, but it can be a problem under domestic law. And so, yes, someone could be prosecuted. I mean, Ukraine has been calling on its population to join these volunteer brigades and to help out. So I don't think Ukraine is going to be prosecuting. But the risk is if you fell into the hands of the enemy, if you were captured, and potentially some countries, once people go home. So if they were, say, in an armed group somewhere, wherever in the world, and then came back to New Zealand, I actually don't know in New Zealand whether our Crimes Act, whether all those provisions can be applied for extraterritorial action or only for action like a murder charge, for example. I admit I don't know. I'm not a domestic criminal lawyer, but that's something obviously I need to look into. But yeah, so how come you can go and do that over there, something that you can't do here? It's also a reason some people say, look, if you really want to fight, then join the armed forces and do it through the proper channels somehow. And other people say, no, governments are the ones that often cause problems, right? So there's also this thing about rebellion and supporting insurgency that sometimes it can be for good reasons. That's why it's so interesting, all these tensions. Yeah.
Also, you think about individual groups could have their justifications for why, for example, violence or armed conflict might be true. I think too, even America right now, that seems to be breaking in three pieces because of what some people think, that civil war is on the way. Or I think to things like the Urewera raids, that sort of thing. There's sometimes there is groups or individuals that think it's highly probable, right, correct to take up arms, but they might be wrong. so I guess that becomes even more problematic. Dr. Lloydd, we want to talk to you more, but it's kind of time for us to move on. And me and George were just messaging away before as we're wrapping up. Can we grab you back at some stage next week? And because I know George in particular has got a shitload more questions to kind of bounce around and bounce off you sort of thing.
Yeah.
If we can
with pleasure, absolutely. No, with pleasure. I could talk about this for hours. As I said, I've been thinking about it for years and years. I still don't have all the answers, but very happy to talk about everything.
Well, the other thing is we're just about to go to Ukraine and talk to Tom.
Yeah, and I want to hear that as well. So
yeah, I've actually already done that conversation. So not spoilers, but he also brought up the point, and I don't think we've talked about it here yet, is that if you are a Ukrainian citizen and you go inside the borders of Ukraine right now and you're of fighting age and you're male, you can't leave, which is another interesting aspect of this whole conversation as well. So I'm not sure if that was in your article, and I'm sure it probably was. I didn't have a good read, but sometimes my dyslexia slides things sideways.
It's not, but there is, I don't know if it's in the conversation or somewhere else. Somebody, I can forward it to you. Someone has written a short piece on that and talking about human rights issues, because normally we have a human right that we're allowed to leave any country, including our own country. So there is a piece about that. I can find it for you, and happy to talk about that at another time.